Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, navigating the new normal, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and the economy, real estate and medicine, technology and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Cloud. I am the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 National American Charitable Organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission in this free public affairs program with a donation of any amount. And visit us, American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, online and donate at afrmc.org. Join us on social media on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. We depend on our audience's support to help the hospital in Israel. So thank you if you can contribute any amount. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. Today's Global Connections topic is, what is the future of our energy supply? Thank you to our very special guest, Jason Bordoff, co-founding Dean of Columbia University's Climate School, Deborah Gordon, Senior Fellow in International and Public Affairs at Brown University, and Matthew Hutson, writer and author at the New Yorker magazine. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. The question of how we supply ourselves with energy looms large behind lots of big stories in the news these days. The most pressing domestic political issue is inflation, to which rising prices for petroleum and natural gas have contributed mightily. Russia's imminent threat to European countries who support Ukrainian independence isn't just military, it's that several of those countries depend on Russia for natural gas. And in Saudi Arabia, after the CIA identified the crown prince as the one who ordered the assassination of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, Joe Biden, as presidential candidate, said he'd treat that country as a pariah. But in fact, Saudi oil reserves are so vast that they can move global prices. And in reality, as we've seen, the policy towards Saudi Arabia has proved less harsh than was promised. Under President Biden, the US rejoined the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change, under which 196 countries have vowed to fight global warming to keep the world's average temperature from rising to any more than 2 degrees centigrade above where it was at the start of the Industrial Revolution, or better if they can't hold that increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. We appear to be hostages to technologies and fuels that have made the modern world as rich as it is, but given their environmental impact, threaten to make life in a postmodern future precarious in some regions of the world. What is our energy future? A big question, and we have an excellent panel of 3 guests to address it. We start with Jason Bordoff, who is a co-founding dean of Columbia University's Climate School. Dean Bordoff is a Harvard-educated lawyer by training. His field of expertise is energy policy. He served in the Treasury during the Clinton administration, and later in the Obama White House, where he rose to the post of Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change on the staff of the National Security Council. Jason Bordoff, thank you very much for joining us today. It's good to see you. I wonder if you can begin by giving us a snapshot. And first, let's deal with this as a country. How do we generate electricity, let's say, and where do we get the fuel to do it?
Yeah, and if we're thinking about climate change and energy more broadly, of course, it's important to think beyond just electricity. We get a meaningful amount of energy as electricity, but we use a lot as fuels for heating our homes, for driving our cars, for making things like steel and cement. Electricity is part of it. And when you look at the energy system overall, in the US and globally, it's not that different. It's still a hydrocarbon-based global energy system. About 80% of the world's energy, about 80% of US energy comes from oil, gas, and coal. And that 80% figure hasn't changed in decades. The total emissions from that 80% has gone up because the denominator's gotten bigger as the world gets wealthier, not just, not the US and Europe even, but when you think of emerging market countries, developing countries, as GDP goes up, people tend to use more energy, and that leads to economic growth. So we're using more energy year after year. The percentages are not changing nearly rapidly enough if you think about what it means to get to a net zero economy. So the growth rates, the annual rate at which clean energy, zero carbon energy is growing, are by far the fastest. But it takes a long time to turn a small number into a big number, even when you have rapid annual growth rates. So it's still a minority is moving from renewable energy.
Well, that's a snapshot of the world today. If we look ahead to 2050, and we succeed in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, and temperatures haven't risen any more than 2 degrees centigrade, how different is the snapshot? How big a change does there have to be for us to achieve the aims that we've signed on to?
Yeah, it's a staggering change, and we should recognize how far off track we are today. Over the last decade, we've seen rising ambition on climate, not just 2 degrees, but well below 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees Celsius, net zero by 2050, driven by the science of climate change. I mean, the world is telling us these are the kind of targets we need to hit. It would require an unprecedented level of transition away from hydrocarbons toward the bulk, probably somewhere close to a majority, if not a majority, would be renewable energy, a lot more nuclear, carbon capture, hydrogen made from zero carbon sources of energy. We're not using zero oil and gas in a world that's net zero. According to the International Energy Agency, if you get to net zero by 2050, you're using about a quarter as much oil, about half as much natural gas. So that's a lot less than today, but it's not zero. And that's partly because we use oil for things we don't burn it for, like making plastics, and also because there's usually in these models some meaningful amount of carbon capture technology. We have emissions, but then we capture and store the emissions somewhere else. But it's a wholesale evolution unlike anything we've seen before. Just to put that in context, when you think of energy transition, when you hear that phrase, people might think about, a chart from 0 to 100%. And over time, going back 150 years, we've seen these great shifts from wood to coal and coal to oil and oil to gas, and increasingly, though still small, renewable energy. That's from 0 to 100%. If you look at total metric tons of energy, total energy use, which is where emissions come from, we've never used less of anything. Because the pie has gotten bigger, we're using so much more energy. So the history of energy is one of clean energy additions, yes, not transitions. We're using more coal, more oil, more gas than we did before. We need to not only meet all of the growth in global energy demand with zero carbon sources or otherwise capture and remove the CO2, but we need to replace the 80% of the mix that today comes from hydrocarbons. And again, that number is getting bigger every year, still not smaller.
I mean, it sounds like to say that these are very ambitious targets is a great understatement. Are they pie in the sky targets, or should we assume that 2 degrees Celsius, I should say, not centigrade, the 2 degrees is impossible to hold us to?
I certainly don't want to say it's impossible. I mean, we know how to get there, broadly speaking. We have a sense of what the technologies would be. Is it possible to do heroic things and to have kind of war scale mobilization and have massive shifts in the economy? We can. Is it necessary? Because the impacts of climate change will be more costly than the cost of this transition. I think it is. But I do think it's important not to sort of be Pollyannish or understate the ambition, how difficult this is. I think there's often, it's helpful to have hope and optimism. I certainly want to have it. Working with young people every day at a university helps give you that. But it doesn't mean we should underestimate the scale of the challenge before us if you really want to take a target like net zero by 2050. And again, we see that each and every day today. Yeah. Oil, gas, coal use are all going up each and every year, other than in a pandemic or a recession.
You've written about an unintended consequence of the move to decarbonization that we might expect. It would seem that that process, as it gains momentum, would lead to lower prices for oil and gas, for fossil fuels, for diminished demand. But you say instead we should expect great volatility with prices, sometimes going up, sometimes going down. Why? Why should that be?
Well, I think we talk a lot about the end state, net zero by 2050, be a great achievement if we could get there. Maybe we get there a little bit later, but net zero in an end state. We don't talk as much about the multi-decade process of getting from here to there, and how messy and uncertain and volatile it's going to. We're going to have shifts in policy from Obama to Trump to Biden. We're going to make bets on certain technologies and maybe get them wrong. We are seeing challenges today in response to a severe energy crisis and a shortfall in Russian energy, where people, including President Biden, who cares deeply about climate, are saying we need more oil and gas from some sources. Can the U.S. refiners, can the U.S. oil industry refine more oil? You don't do that in the next 1, 2, 3 years. Those are multi-decade investments. Well, people might not make those investments today if they think the world might need it for a few years, but not in the long term. So we're going to have periods of underinvestment. The pace at which demand falls, if supply falls faster than demand falls, you get market crunches, price spikes, shortages, and that could lead to more volatility and periods of higher prices, and actually could make petrostates for periods of time more necessary and relevant and influential before they become less influential. That is maybe not unrelated to the fact that one of the items on President Biden's agenda when he goes to Saudi Arabia is talking about more oil production.
You've cautioned against countries abandoning old energy generating systems before new systems are in place to actually be dependable. Did Germany make a mistake by going off nuclear and shifting away from it, increasing its dependence on Russian natural gas?
I think it did. I think we see that today. I think for the reasons I said earlier, given how challenging it's going to be to get to these goals, I think we need all tools at our disposal. We need a lot of renewable energy, solar and wind for sure, batteries, electrification, but we're going to need nuclear, we're going to need hydrogen, we're going to need carbon capture technology and carbon removal technology, and it's still going to be a Herculean task to get there. Nuclear is certainly not without risk, but for a variety of reasons, improvements in the technology, a recognition that we need nuclear as, we need firm zero carbon baseload, meaning renewables are intermittent. Sometimes the sun shines, sometimes it doesn't, the wind blows, sometimes it doesn't. Nuclear can run 24/7. We need some sources that can run all the time in order to help lower the cost of getting to net zero. And when you shut down nuclear power, we've seen it in parts of the East Coast, we've seen it in California, we've seen it in Germany, at least in the near to medium term, natural gas is usually what fills the gap. That was true in Germany and, was not the whole reason they were so dependent on Russia. It was a set of policy choices they made, but it certainly didn't help.
You mentioned thinking over the past 100, 150 years. I wanted to run some numbers past you, some numbers over the past 200 years from the Canadian scientist Václav Smil's book, How the World Really Works. He writes that since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, humans, since around 1800, humans have gained so much energy at their disposal that it's as if every human today enjoys the year 1800 equivalent of 60 adults working day and night for just that person. And in affluent countries like ours, we enjoy our ancestors' equivalent of over 200 people laboring nonstop for each of us. The age of fossil fuel has brought with it phenomenal growth in wealth and convenience and leisure and you name it. Does going off fossil fuel ultimately mean giving up the kind of growth we have experienced? Or can we continue to grow and have the equivalent of still more 1,800 humans working for each of us as we decarbonize?
I certainly don't think it needs to. It is an important point that Vakov Smil makes in his book, this one, and all of them are really brilliant to read. We have a severe climate crisis, largely because of the emissions from consuming fossil fuels. Consuming fossil fuels has dramatically expanded prosperity, GDP growth, and improved well-being in terms of the energy. Energy makes people's lives better, refrigerating your food, air conditioning, medicine, keeping your medicine cold, on and on. And we consume huge amounts in the US and Europe and other developed nations. Developing world has consumed almost none at all. That won't stay that way. We don't want it to stay that way. We want the developing world to use more energy for prosperity and for rising levels of GDP. We need to do it in a way that doesn't lead to the same amount of carbon emissions. That means dealing with the carbon emissions in some way or finding zero carbon sources of energy. And we know how to do some of that. The 90+% decline in solar costs and wind costs and battery costs over the last decade has been phenomenal. So clean energy can do a lot more today than we thought it could, 15 years ago. We still need some more technological innovation to bring to commercial scale. Other technologies will need, because renewables can do a lot, but they can't do everything. But we broadly know what that toolkit can look like. And we have technology today that can capture and store CO2, that can make zero carbon fuels. We just have to advance the technology, bring the cost down, and get it to commercial scale. Sometimes it may be cheaper than fossil fuels, sometimes it may be more expensive, but I think on balance, the cost of making that transition, if we do it in a smart way, is less than the cost of not dealing with it, which means the costs of climate change impacts themselves.
Dean Bordoff, stick with us, because I will be coming back to you in a little while for the question and answer period. But thank you very much for being our guest today.
Thank you.
And we turn now to our second panelist, Deborah Gordon. She is a senior principal in the Climate Intelligence Program at RMI. That's a think tank focused on energy. She's also a senior fellow at the Hutson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University. By training, she's a chemical engineer, and she started out at a big oil company, Chevron. At RMI, she leads the Oil and Gas Solutions Initiative. She's the author also of the book, No Standard Oil. Deborah Gordon, welcome to the program.
Pleasure.
I just used the phrase oil and gas solutions, and I realized that to a lot of people who think of themselves as environmentalists, that's an oxymoron. I'm talking about the problem, not the solution. But as I understand what you've written and what you've worked on, oil and gas are going to be with us for quite a while. And there's a huge difference between oil and gas that are produced by best practices and by worst practices. And we can control a lot of emissions just following best practices. Is that about right?
That's right. I mean, I asked this question to myself a decade ago when fracking really took off. And I thought to myself, the hypothesis was, if the oil and gas that we're accessing is changing, which it is. I mean, fracked oil is nothing like the, kind of conventional oil out of Saudi Arabia, different chemistry, different physics, and also different processes. If all of those things about oil and gas are changing, what does that mean for emissions? Because we can't really assume that they'll all be the same. And that led to the research that the book, Robert, that you cited, No Standard Oil, is about. And then also a web tool that's open source called the Oil Climate Index Plus Gas that RMI just released, modeling half the world's oil and gas. And there is no standard oil, to the point where the difference in emissions intensities between two equivalent barrels of oil and gas could be a factor of 5. So in other words, there's a lot of emissions right now that we're not avoiding because we're focusing largely, as we have the last 30 years, on reducing demand, which is of course very important. But if we use, as Jason was saying, if we're fortunate enough to be able to use 25% less of our oil or 50% less of our gas, I mean, really cut away at the demand, the question is, what oil supplies and gas supplies will remain? Because if they are twice or 5 times more carbon intensive, climate intensive than what we might otherwise use, we'll have worked really hard not to make much of a dent in this problem. Whereas if we're using the lowest intensity barrels of oil and gas, these are multiplier effects, and the climate needs as many multiplier effects as it can get.
Give us an example of best practices. What's a country or a company or a country that does an exceptionally good job of extracting oil or gas?
Every country has wide ranges, unfortunately, but I will hold out Norway as one of the countries that is an example here. And there are others as well. But Norway approaches, they've been at this for about 50 years, offshore. Their offshore platforms are not like ours. They're not relatively individual operations by different operators, dotting the Gulf of Mexico. They're integrated systems. So a certain platform will produce, and a certain platform will re-inject, and a certain platform will process. And then they work in a system, and they are more and more getting to the point where they're importing electricity to run all of their units, their generator, their heat, their steam, from onshore hydro. So they're using renewables as inputs to the oil and gas system. And that's what's so different. And that's part of what Jason was talking about, opportunities to go here. Oil and gas exist on the back of oil and gas. We use natural gas, diesel, petroleum coke. We use a lot of really dirty fossil fuels to produce, transport, process oil and gas before I even go to the gas station. And that's a huge opportunity for this sector to cut its emissions.
If you were to look for the other end of the scale, by the way, with the anti-Norway, where would you look to find the most expensive and the worst environmental impact from oil and gas drilling?
Yeah, and we, on the OCI Plus, this Oil Climate Index Plus class web tool, we have a shadow price. So you can actually look at this both in terms of emissions and also in terms of, what it would cost if we actually did have a carbon price. But I have to say, one of the only benefits I can think of from what's happening horrifically in Ukraine is that the Russian gas isn't flowing as mightily, because it is so bad in Russia that you can see methane emissions from space. What's happening is the pipelines, which are remote in Siberia, they're cracking under melting permafrost. So there's gas that's coming, less gas is almost going through the pipeline than what's being actually, expelled from the pipeline in a lot of those places. And there are other countries that have issues. I'd say that the Texas Permian is not great. I mean, overall, there are thousands of producers there, and some are much better than others. But overall, as a basin, we flare and get rid of and waste that gas way too much. We're not putting it into productive use, which is, a shame, especially with a warming world.
You told me that you can see there's a distinct difference between the Permian, this big oil field in the Southwest, that is in Texas, and the part that's in New Mexico. That the difference in actions on either side of the state line are significant in terms of how much leakage there is and how much pollution there is.
Yeah, and part of that comes down to how old the system is. I mean, think Spindletop. Texas has been at this a very long time, and there's a lot of legacy production there. Part of it is regulation. I mean, New Mexico just has a much tighter handle on regulation than Texas has had historically. And part of it is that in New Mexico, it's a very gas-oriented system, so they have a lot of takeaway capacity. California, say, imports a lot of its gas from New Mexico, so they're already buyers. Whereas in the Permian in Texas, it's an oil system. So the economics are very liquids based. I make money producing oil. So, I'll throw the gas away and I'll still make a lot of money.
So as you said, if we could reduce the amount of oil and gas that we use, and if the oil and gas that we used, it would matter a great deal whether we were using the best practice produced or the worst practice produced. My question is what Norway is doing more expensive than what Russia is doing by not taking care of its pipeline in Siberia? Would they have a price advantage in trying to survive the age of decarbonization? Or are they losing so much oil that in fact they're inefficient?
It's interesting. Climate change is going to have these feedback loops, and a lot of infrastructure beyond the pipelines in Russia are going to be harmed by climate change. Sea level rise, hurricanes. They almost lost one of the ports in Texas during a big hurricane a couple of years ago when the tankers turned around and almost went onto the ground. So there's going to be a lot of disruption. And I think this goes into the adaptation category, that thinking ahead on what systems we want to build anew. A big problem in the oil gas sector, especially the oil sector, is this is an industry that's been around for over a century. And a lot of these systems and a lot of the engineering practices were designed in like 1930. They were not designed when we were thinking climate change was an issue. So part of it, your question, will be more expensive for legacy operators. Yeah, I mean, if you're operating an old system and making money, it's always going to be more expensive to retrofit. But I know that the global South countries, a lot of the old Commonwealth countries from the UK, Ghana, Guyana, Gabon, they want to get into this business. Now, many people in the North are saying, no, you can't, no oil and gas. The reality is some of these countries might actually leapfrog what we are able to do and do it a whole different, better way for that remainder of the oil and gas that stays in the economy.
Just like countries that never bothered finishing the terrible landline telephone system and went straight to mobile phones. You said that this question for you began considering the difference between fracking and other kinds of extraction. Is fracking an inherently, well, good or bad way of extracting oil or gas?
The one thing to realize is fracking is nothing like what we used to do. So anything that's new has risks. And it's not as if we're managing the conventional oil production and gas all that perfectly, but now we have new risks. Big risk with fracking is methane. So these are lighter oils and wet gases that come out with fracking. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and they leak. These systems just aren't designed to be leak-free, and that's a big problem. Fracking also has issues with water. You're going in and changing the substructure of the reservoir. So it introduces new risks. And honestly, it's about a decade old. And I think we're still learning a lot about what those risks are, but they do avoid us. Fracking does avoid us relying too heavily on extra heavy oils, because the extra heavy oils, and those are from California, from Canada, Venezuela, Mexico, our refineries selectively use these very heavy oils. And very heavy oils have way too much carbon in them. You have to first unearth all of this weight of carbon out of the ground. Then you have to separate it and crack it and throw a lot of heat and steam at it. And now, as Matthew will talk about, then we have to design these huge systems to do carbon capture for all the carbon that was in the ground in the first place. So the good news about fracking is it's moved us more to the lighter barrels of oil that are much easier to turn into the things that we depend on day in and day out: petrochemical feedstock, gasoline, jet fuel, things like that.
Well, Debbie Gordon, thank you very much. Stick with us because we're going to have the Q&A session in about 10 minutes. But thank you for pointing out that when we speak of oil, we're using a very crude term. Yes. Our third panelist, as Deborah Gordon just mentioned, is Matthew Hutson. He's a contributing writer to The New Yorker, where he covers science and technology. In an article back in April, he reported on the technology that's being developed to address a key problem with renewable energy. The title of that article says it all: The renewable energy revolution will need renewable storage. Matthew Hudson, welcome to our.
Thanks for having me.
And before you talk about the solutions, I want you to describe the problem a little bit. Wind and solar energy depend on phenomena that are actually beyond the control of the oil companies or the energy companies. How windy or sunny is it, or how windy or sunny isn't it? This is the problem.
Yeah, so when we talk about renewable energy, we often talk about the source of the renewable energy. Building more solar panels, building more wind farms, and we neglect to talk about what we do with that energy once we have it. So the wind doesn't always blow when you need it. The sun's not always out when you need it. So the energy that we use doesn't always perfectly line up with the energy that's provided by nature. And so we need to store up that energy when we have it and then use it later. And there are various options that are being used right now. The biggest is called pumped hydro, which accounts for about 90% of the energy storage for the grid, which is basically you have two reservoirs. You use the electricity to pump the water from the lower reservoir up to the higher reservoir. And then when you need the electricity later, you let the water come down and it spins a turbine and that generates electricity again. Then there are also lithium ion batteries, And those are being used increasingly often, but both of these have problems that we can talk about later.
Yeah. Well, one problem, the aforementioned, I promise that I'll limit my Václav Smil references in the course of this entire hour, but he wrote that pumped hydro storage in that operation, about a quarter of the generated electricity is used pumping the water up from the lower reservoir to the higher reservoir to be ready to come down and produce energy, so that it's an expensive way of storing energy.
So all of these solutions for energy storage, none of them are 100% efficient. So you're never going to get all of the energy back out that you put in. That's not the biggest problem. With pumped hydro, you can't do it everywhere. You need the right geographical location. You need two locations, one's higher, one's lower, that are close to each other, that are not too, where you don't have cities, you don't have things that are already built there. So it needs to be kind of out of the way, but close enough to an urban center where people are going to be using the energy. And then there are also regulations about where you can build them. So there's sort of a NIMBY problem. And then they're very expensive to build, and it can take a decade or more to build them. So in the US, they're not being built very often. They're being built more often in China, but right now in the US, they're not being built very often.
And the issue, go ahead.
I was just going to touch on lithium ion batteries.
Yes, lithium ion batteries. One of the issues there is that you don't have to go digging for oil to run a lithium ion battery. You have to go digging for cobalt. And
yes.
I gather the Arabian Sea of cobalt is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yeah,
that's where the cobalt is.
Yeah, so lithium ion batteries, you can use them anywhere. They're very convenient and they're very reliable, but they have multiple issues. One is that they rely on lithium and cobalt, and there are problems with mining those. It's not very environmentally friendly to mine them, and there are supply chain issues. They're not evenly distributed around the world, those two elements. Sometimes they come from countries that don't have good working practices. So they might rely on child labor, for instance. And then if there are political issues, they might not have a reliable source to obtain those elements to build the batteries. The batteries typically last for only 3 or 4 hours before they're out of charge. So it'll last longer than that. You need to buy more batteries, which gets expensive. And over time they degrade and you can't recycle them very often. They're also dangerous. Sometimes they can catch fire. So there are lots of issues, and they have become much cheaper over the years.
Mm-hmm.
But experts say there's a limit to how cheap they can get before you bump up against physical limits.
Do you get the impression that the future of electric vehicles will be constrained by just how much lithium and cobalt can be mined and can be used to make electric cars?
Not as much. They're sort of the first priority right now. People are willing to pay a lot for electric vehicles, and they sort of take precedence over grid energy storage.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have people don't drive cars typically for 24/7. So you might drive for a couple hours and then you can recharge. So that sort of eliminates the problem there.
Better suited to that purpose than to the grid. You after you described, I think, very vividly this notion of two lakes or two reservoirs, one higher than the other, and pumping water up with electricity when there is electricity, and then letting the water become a hydroelectric dam, I guess, when you open it up. You also described in the New Yorker, and you have to tell me if this exists or only in people's head, a kind of use of solid blocks performing the same purpose as the water. That is, you would use the electricity to raise what strike me in my mind as sort of like solid block elevators up to the top of a structure. And then when electricity is needed, drop them, and the kinetic energy of the fall. Does that exist? Is there such a place?
Not yet. So the article focuses on these alternatives to pumped hydro and to lithium ion batteries. And so one place I visited was a testing site for a company called Energy Vault in Switzerland. And their first idea was to use a crane to stack these blocks made of dirt, basically stuck together with a kind of polymer. And you'd use the electricity to power the crane to just stack blocks up on top of each other. And then later you would lower the blocks, which would then turn a motor or turn a generator to produce electricity again. They've moved on to a situation where it's basically an automated warehouse where they use elevators to lift blocks up and then sort of trolleys to move them to the center. And you store these blocks on the upper levels. And then later you can store them on the lower levels to produce electricity again. At the site that I saw, they did not have this working. They were still, they had sort of a structure that didn't have elevators and trolleys on it yet. So it's still something that they're developing. So this does not exist yet. They have some projects in other countries and in China and Australia that they're working on, but nothing that is, full speed ahead.
And then you also reported on, it's sort of a variant on pumped hydro, but instead of the water going up, you're pressurizing the water under the ground. You're kind of using fracking techniques to create, I guess, pressure from the water that then creates electricity.
Yeah, so there's a company called QuidNet based in Texas that is using this. And one advantage is that they're using a lot of the same technologies and equipment that the fracking industry has used. So basically they're just pumping water underground. And then it kind of creates what they call a lens. It splits two layers of rock and it creates a layer of water in between them. And it's sort of squeezed between the layers of rock and stored at high pressure. Then later they can release the water, it comes back up, turns a turbine, and that produces electricity again.
And again, the reason why this is so important is that if we were really to have our power grid powered largely by plants using renewable energies, the new renewables, wind, solar, are going to have lots of downtime where they won't be feeding the system with electricity. Yeah.
So first, I also want to touch on some of the other solutions that people have talked about. So some people have mentioned that it's sort of caveman technology. These are very simple concepts. So it's not this kind of high-tech electrochemical batteries. It's things like lifting up blocks or pressurizing water. Another common solution is heating things up, molten salt or metal, just making things hot and then using the heat later, or pressurizing pressurizing air in caverns or in tanks, or spinning things around and storing the energy as momentum. So these are kind of simple physical concepts, and there's this whole plethora of ideas that people are exploring, which is fun to think about. Another is creating hydrogen, which can then be used in fuel cells. So it's a lot of it is managing grid management, figuring out both the distribution of energy and when people will be using it and the economics, so that you can have a range of solutions that can store electricity for varying amounts of time. And all these solutions have different pluses and minuses. So I don't think there's going to be one solution that will solve all of these problems. There will be different things at different price points, different levels of efficiency, and that store electricity in different places and for different amounts of time.
Well, Matthew Hutson, thank you very much. Stick with us right now because I'm going to bring back our other panelists, Deborah Gordon and Jason Bordoff. And let me hear from each of you about what you've heard from your fellow panelists, and if there's something that you'd like to either underscore or undermine of what they've said. Jason first.
Yeah, no, it was I learned a lot, really insightful comments, and agreed with what was said. We're going to need, it is important to distinguish between different types of oil and how they're produced, and the great work Deborah's done for a long time. I think it's fair to say that while the points she was making are things we ought to be looking at in terms of where production comes from. That doesn't mean it is what we will look to in terms of where production will come from. So you would imagine it won't only be the cleanest barrels, it might be the lowest cost barrels. Often those are in the Gulf Arab states and in OPEC countries. You might imagine that in a world that gets to very ambitious climate goals, certain countries put much more stringent restrictions on whether you can produce than in other countries. And we see a lot of pressure, for example, here in the US to restrict oil and gas production as part of a strategy. So even if certain barrels are cleaner, you can imagine in Norway, for example, that might be a country that in which climate activism might pick up pace before you would see it in a country like Saudi Arabia. Maybe they'd restrict their production. So a bunch of other factors will determine where oil and gas gets produced in a transition. And the only point I make about long duration storage, which we absolutely need to balance the intermittency of renewables, even that alone, I don't think in all the modeling I'm familiar with, we're going to get most of our zero carbon electricity from renewables with both short-term and long-term storage, but we are still, it is cheaper in all that modeling if you look at scenarios that involve some degree of firm dispatchable power electricity that can be deployed 24/7. That could be gas with carbon capture, it could be nuclear power, but whether it's the International Energy Agency, the Princeton did a big study of net zero across the United States, a range of others. The ones I'm familiar with show that it's cheaper to get there at some meaningful amount. Estimates vary, 10, 20, 30% of electricity is also coming from some of those electricity sources that can run any time of the day.
Okay, Deborah Gordon, comments on what you've heard.
Yeah, I mean, Jason raised a good point about the Gulf, and it's interesting. Well, Saudi Arabia and Qatar have very low climate intensity oil and gas, so they're kind of winning the charge and they know it. They've been at it a long time, but it raises another point that maybe was on the sidelines of what we've been talking about, the lack of transparency in the sector. And I think Jason talked about price volatility and the issues that we're going to face trying to make our climate goals and deal with what you said, Robert, inflation. I mean, a lot of these other countervailing forces. And the reality is we don't have a lot of transparency here. And I think the Gulf has a big incentive. Saudi Arabia, number one, has a big incentive to be fully transparent. They are the world market. They want everyone to buy their product, their crude. They're building more refineries, and they have low intensity production to boot. So I think that will really help. With Matthew, I was laughing to myself because the lithium conundrum is so funny because we're finding a lot of lithium in produced water in Texas. So, in fact, some people would call West Texas a water producer, not an oil producer. If they were very serious about this, they produce more water than they produce oil, and then they have to dispose of it. But it turns out a lot of that water has a lot of lithium in it as it comes underground from those reservoirs. And I can see the oil industry becoming a lithium provider. This whole industry, it's what Jason was saying, it's kind of up for grabs, and then the last thing I'll say that ties together what was said, I really think that we need surgical 2% solution thinking here. I think we're very much oriented to almost like, New Year's resolution of I'm going to lose 30 pounds this year. Instead, in order to really be healthy, you have to just change little by little what you do. And it's great to have a goal. It's great to have an aspiration, but I think that's been guiding us since the Arab oil embargo and not the real understanding of these sectors and how to deal with them.
And Matthew Hudson, comments on what you've heard?
Yeah, I think what Jason and Deborah both make clear is that it's not just about science and the technology and not just about the economics. There's also a big political element to this. So some countries may produce energy sources more efficiently or more cleanly or cheaper than other countries, but that doesn't mean that we should necessarily rely on them. There may be conflicts in those countries. There's the issue with Russia right now. And then just forecasting the future, it's hard to tell at what rate we will be decreasing our reliance on fossil fuels. So we were, as Jason was saying, we'll still use them for energy production, and we'll still use them for manufacturing things like plastic. And we'll still need to keep building the resources to process these natural fuels or these fossil fuels. But that's a huge investment, and we have to figure out the trade-offs in terms of things might cost more or less now versus more or less in the future, and we don't really know. There's a lot of uncertainty there. And then there's also another element, which is the sort of public opinion. There's a lot of nuance to these issues. People might say like, oh, fossil fuels are bad, we shouldn't invest in these things. We should just cut all reliance on them. But the picture isn't that simple. And it might be hard to communicate some of these complexities to the public.
I'd like to put what you've just said about politics to Jason, who not too long ago was doing energy policy on the National Security Council staff. If you were if you had been on the trip to Saudi Arabia that President Biden took, here you are, president of a country where people are paying twice at the pump what they were paying a couple of years ago. It's a huge burden on lots of Americans, and you're talking with the Saudis. What's the message to them?
I think there's a starting point is I think there's a perception, at least in some energy and climate circles, that this trip is about oil. Gasoline prices are high. Not many places you can get extra oil supply from. We released our strategic oil stocks. He called on the U.S. oil industry to produce more. There's not that much more they can do beyond what they're already doing. So now call Riyadh, and that is something presidents of both parties have done for 50 years. But I do think it's important to note there are many other primary drivers of this visit and why the team of Middle East experts around President Biden think it is important to have a strong U.S.-Saudi relationship for reasons of stability in the Middle East, counter-terrorism, intelligence sharing, and all the rest. In addition to that, the fact that oil prices are high and gasoline and diesel prices are high, and that's contributing to inflation, is certainly an extra factor. And I suspect publicly and privately, you'll see continued calls from the US and some others in Europe for OPEC, largely Saudi Arabia, to increase oil production even faster. We should recognize there's a limit to how much they can actually do. By the end of the summer, they will have finished a plan to put more oil on the market each and every month. They can go a bit beyond that, but not a huge amount beyond that. So if you think about how much oil Russia produces or how tight markets were even before Russia invaded Ukraine, Saudi can help somewhat. They can't replace the lost oil supply if we really see Russian oil off the market. So we should kind of keep our expectations in check.
But presumably, if Saudi oil actually did displace Russian oil in the marketplace, Deborah, that would fit your example of seeing more of a better quality, a higher standard of oil in the market.
Yeah, it also changes Russia's thinking. I mean, they're a resource rent state. They can't exist very long under an embargoed state. Although ironically, Iran has done okay being embargoed, but I think a lot of gray oil makes the market. That's Iranian oil. But it changes the signal to Russia to come back into the market if they're up against more responsible producers. So that's the question. Like, would you discount the price of Russian oil when it comes back on the market because it's that much dirtier? And I think the satellites are going to help a lot with this. And it will bridge the civil society question, because I think that people, ordinary citizens, have a hard time imagining climate change and it's global, and even oil and gas or energy. Gosh, that's even a bigger pot. But when you start to see satellite images and you know that methane is associated with air toxins that are polluting their communities, I think it does change the conversation at home.
I would just add to that, the reason to sanction Russian oil, maybe for Saudi or other supply instead, and is not because of climate.
Yeah.
And the message to Russia is not clean up your act to get it to market. It's stop murdering Ukrainians. But
yeah, I think it's more a matter of someday, if they ever behave better, they'd have to come back into the market, and there might be different conditions that they face when they come back into the market.
Matthew Hudson, I have a question for you about research, and the projects that you've described are not being done, unless I've missed something, they're not being done by the existing big energy companies. They're outsiders. Is there, I'm thinking back to a day when Exxon, or it used to be SO Labs, ranked with Bell Labs as one of the most creative science shops in the country. Is there creative research being done within big oil and gas companies?
There may be, but their incentive is to keep us reliant on oil and gas and coal, whereas these technologies tend to pair best with renewable energy, with solar and wind. They don't exclusively pair with those. There are also uses for just keeping the grid stable, for instance. And a couple of years ago in Texas, there was a big power outage because the natural gas plants kind of seized up. So these are technologies that are applicable with any energy source, but they will benefit renewable energy the most. And so that's why you have a lot of startups that are not tied to oil and gas. And they're receiving funding from the government, from the DOE, or from investors who see sort of a new kind of future.
I'd like to hear from all of you about your sense of the future of electronic vehicles, and whether you think we've hit an inflection point, and if only the supply chains were working, we'd be seeing big leaps in sales, or whether it's going to remain, the electric vehicle is going to remain largely a luxury product and not a mass market vehicle. Jason, what do you think?
I have an electric vehicle. I like it a lot. It's my wife took my daughter visiting colleges around the Northeast recently and rented a car because the amount of driving they had to do meant it was would have been quite inconvenient to stop as often as they would have had to stop to charge. So I think there still are some barriers. I think we need to build out our charging infrastructure, need costs to come down a bit. And then the amount, if you get these to scale and really grow them at very large annual growth rates, we do start to really need to think about the issues of critical minerals and the kind of inputs we need to build the batteries. But the growth rates are tremendous. They are great vehicles and great products. I'm really optimistic that in many parts of the world, you're going to see electric vehicles compete very well, even without government support, and they're going to take off really quickly. There are different challenges in different parts of the world. So you got to think about parts of the world we talked about before, which have trouble keeping their electricity system reliable 24/7 as it is. Mm-hmm. Switching from 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles like tuk-tuks or bicycles to cars, there's a different set of challenges there thinking about trying to deploy electric vehicles. And we're going to need this to be global. And even then, we should not forget that cars around the world make up only about 20 or 25% of the world's oil use. So we got a bunch of other parts of where oil is used that we need to make progress on. And it'll be harder to electrify things like trucks and airplanes and all the rest.
Deborah Gordon, do you foresee an e-vehicle future?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is less about the demand side and EVs taking over. I think that the signal is there. The fear is there from the oil industry to wonder, because gasoline and diesel, especially gasoline, has been the cash cow of this industry. And it opens the door for something I'm not seeing happen, which is concerning, to refining. The question is, refining is like a game of Jenga, those little blocks that go up. And if you poke out this 20% or 25 or 30% of gasoline, the refinery has to work technically and economically. And so it's not seamless going from no gasoline, no petrol demand, no gasoline demand to, what we have today without really changing our refining sectors. So I think the hidden benefit of electric vehicles is decarbonizing refining. There's also another interesting thing that I'm noticing. There are a lot of commercials on TV with heavy trucks, having people go off-road and plug in their computers and have backup power in their driveways from there. So I think it's crossing over kind of a New England, California Prius mindset into like the Ford F-150 mindset. So it just tells me that, things are, they're hot.
Yeah, the Ford F-150 this is a big step which is taking place. The Ford is going to take its cash cow, I guess, the pickup truck, and go electric. Matthew Hudson, are you very bullish on the e-vehicle future?
Just following the current trends, yeah, I expect them to continue. But a big issue is the grid. In some cases, driving an electric car can be even worse for the environment than driving a gas-fueled car if the electricity comes from a coal plant, for instance. And so we need to energize them with green electricity. And then just to make them convenient and to make them more appealing to people, you need the grid to be able to, you need charging stations. Right now, there are gas stations everywhere. You need high-speed charging stations everywhere also, like at homes and on highways and at work. Otherwise, people are going to have this anxiety about sort of range anxiety. They're going to run out of power, and then what?
This is supposed to be part of the infrastructure bill, I thought, and that we're supposed to have 1 million new charging stations. And it has always struck me that any country that can put an overpriced coffee shop in every other strip mall in America could create any geographical spread of necessary infrastructure, since we've achieved the implausible already. Do you think the American household is about to become a lot more green, Jason? I mean, are there things in our daily lives that are that might change? And
I think there are a lot more products available to people, demand side technologies, even simple things that are pretty common now, like a Nest thermostat or something else. A lot of technologies for your home that can improve energy efficiency. I wrote a piece recently about how, in response to the current energy crisis we're in, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, particularly in Europe this winter, we're talking a lot about where extra supply can come from, like oil and gas. We're not talking enough about how to reduce demand, and the need for conservation and efficiency, and technology can help with that. I do think it's important just to acknowledge, how much of this is a system problem, though. I mean, you want to be green in your home, but you plug something into the wall and it's not up to you. I mean, to some extent, there are some choices you can make, but for the most part, it's a system that produces airplanes and how they're fueled, and when you get on one, or how the steel and cement is made for the new home you're building, or where the electricity comes from. So there's a lot individuals can do. One of the most important things they can do is encourage political change and policy change that will change that overall system that often is beyond their immediate control.
Would whoever wants to answer or has a thought, but would requiring high-rise buildings to have solar panels on their roofs, I mean, would it be a significant change in our energy profile? The place where I grew up, I have to say, is a big project in Lower Manhattan called Stuyvesant Town, and when Stuyvesant Town put solar panels on its roofs, I believe the amount of solar paneling in Manhattan rose by something like 25 or 30%. It's a big development, but that suggests that all of these high buildings, which, unlike my current neighborhood, that there aren't trees blocking the ceiling of the Seagram's building or something like that. You could be putting panels there. Would it produce a lot of electricity? Matthew, do you want to?
I'm not super well read on this, but I imagine that putting solar panels on the top of a high rise, the ratio of solar panels to people in the building and energy use is probably not very high. So I don't think that is a huge solution. It's worth thinking about just construction. About 8% of anthropogenic emissions come from steel production. Another 7 or 8% come from concrete production. A lot of this is for buildings. So if we can figure out a way to reduce those emissions, I wrote another article for the New Yorker about green steel, producing steel in a way that reduces not CO2, but just water into the atmosphere. So there's a lot of room for improvement in construction.
I'd like to poll the three of you, since you all work in different ways around questions of energy. And before you go, I'd just like to ask you, do you find yourself doing your work imbued with a sense of optimism at all the creative projects that are underway and changes that have taken place? Or do you dread the year 2050 to think of what life is actually going to be like, given the current pace of change? Who'd like to start? Jason Bordoff?
I'll say it is hard sometimes to be optimistic when you are looking at work like Vaclav Smil's, or spending time, as I do, with energy numbers, energy data. Think about the pandemic, right? In the middle, in the pandemic, at the peak, we shut down something like half the global economy. About 4 billion people were under lockdown, couldn't move around. That year, carbon emissions fell 6%. We need carbon emissions to fall more than that each and every year through the rest of the decade if we want to be on track for goals like net zero by 2050. These are really hard goals to achieve. And when you kind of work with the numbers, you realize how challenging it is. I will come back to something I kind of hinted at earlier, or maybe I said it, I can't recall. You can't not feel inspired every day when you work with young people, as I do on a college campus. And it sounds, I don't know, a little corny to say, but it's absolutely true. They're brilliant, they're passionate, and they care deeply about this issue in a way that simply was not true for their parents or their grandparents. And when they go to the polling place and when they talk to their political leaders, if this is not the number one issue, it's the number 2 or 3 issue. And we need that sense of urgency and mobilization in order to drive the technology and policy change we need.
Deborah Gordon?
Yeah, I mean, like Jason, I work here at Brown, and being around students and feeling like there are those that want to pick up the baton and really ask the right questions and get smarter. I'm optimist. I'm just an optimist by nature, though, but I do believe we can manage what we can measure. I really think that knowing things helps us. And when things get bad, we get better at solving them. I mean, that's how, as horrible as the pandemic has been, people, we're getting through this. We will survive this. And look at Zoom, like new things have come out of it. So I mean, I am optimistic. That's not to say, it's all easy and daisies. It's not. This is hard, but who lives a life that doesn't have challenges? Like, it's real. I feel like we're living something that has to be dealt with, and it's very real.
And Matthew Hutson, from without benefit of undergraduates surrounding you.
Well, by the way, I was an undergrad at Brown, and I love the tech.
So was I.
Oh, nice. Was this planned? Anyway, so I'm immersed in the science and technology world. So I'm incredibly optimistic just about the cool new things that are being invented and the cool new findings that people are learning. Whether those will be implemented and funded, and whether we have the will to and the coordination to use those tools to change the world. I don't know. It's hard to say whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. Some things will get better, some things will get worse. Overall, a lot of things will change.
Well, Matthew Hudson, Jason Bordoff, Deborah Gordon, thanks to all 3 of you for being with us today. And many thanks to Joshua Plout, Nate Banzani, Ronnie Giuliano, and Adrian Kiss of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and also our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization. It represents, in the United States, Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The website of the Friends Group is www.afrmc.org. Join us next month for Free Speech in an Age of Disinformation, with special guests, Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School, Jelani Cobb, incoming Dean at Columbia Journalism School, and Jeffrey Rosen, the President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal.